Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Asad Lalji. On behalf of the royal family of Gondal, Ashish Doshi, Honorary Director, and myself, welcome to a very special evening here at the Royal Opera House, Mumbai. As many of you know, the Opera House reopened in October of 2016 after a hiatus of 26 years. The response has been overwhelming from the city and many of our collaborators, some of whom are here today, so we'd like to thank you for that. And for those who are visiting us for the first time, welcome, and we hope you come back again and again. And for your benefit, a brief introduction about this iconic venue. Widely touted as Mumbai's cultural crown jewel, the Royal Opera House is India's only surviving opera house. It was inaugurated in 1911 by King George V and eventually completed in 1916. The space became a cinema in later years before closing its doors. Owned by the royal family of Gondal since the 50s, it was eventually restored under the leadership and patronage of the present Maharaja, Shri Jyotendra Singh Ji. Today, we stand as a key performance and creative hub in the city's cultural landscape while being a premier heritage landmark. In fact, we received an Award of Merit in the 2017 UNESCO Asia Pacific Awards for Cultural Heritage Conservation. The Royal Opera House has a rich legacy within the performing arts. We've had a number of musical legends grace our stage over the years. Unfortunately, the Beatles are not one of them. So tonight, Avid Learning and the Royal Opera House proudly present a book launch, a panel discussion, a performance as an homage to the four boys from Liverpool, celebrating the launch of Ajoy Bose's exciting new book, Across the Universe, The Beatles in India. Ajoy Bose has written an acclaimed book on the emergency, For Reason of State and Benji, the definitive political biography of Dalit leader Mayawati. A leading television commentator and columnist, he now uses his formidable investigative skills to look beyond politics, recreating a fascinating journey of the Beatles in India half a century ago. Our evening will begin with opening remarks by Naresh Fernandez. Naresh is a senior journalist. He's the editor of Scroll.in, a digital daily. He's the author of City Adrift, a short biography of Bombay, and Taj Mahal Foxtrot, the story of Bombay's jazz age. Following which, the author will be in conversation with journalist, author, and founding editor of The Wire, Siddharth Bhatia, who will discuss the book and the Beatles within the larger context. Siddharth has written several books on cinema and popular culture and is the author of India Psychedelic, the story of a rocking generation. Pioneering local rockers, Devika and Suresh Bhojwani, who were heavily inspired by the Beatles, will then end the evening on a high note with performances of selections of the best-loved Beatles numbers. So without further ado, Naresh, let's take the show on the road.
Thanks. Good evening. Every day, Bombay seems to lose yet another building or institution that we imagined would be with us forever. Each time I trundle down the Muhammad Ali Road flyover, for instance, I see an enormous canyon in place of the lanes that used to house the record sellers of Chor Bazaar, the place where during my frequent pilgrimages starting from the mid-1980s, I bought every single Beatles album for 20 rupees or less. Not so long ago, we lost Rhythm House, which had many attractions, not the least of which was that row of record listening booths in whose soundproof confines hundreds of young Bombayites developed an appreciation for a wide range of eclectic music, and also for the charms of the particular friend they'd chosen to cocoon themselves away with. Older people in this audience will remember the excitement of listening to performances at the Blue Frog in the first decade of this millennium. And the young people here will remember the fun times they had at the Slip Disc in Colaba in the 1970s. But even as we mourn these places, this city has an uncanny way of clinging to memories. Many people still remember that crazy day in April 1944 when a ship called the Fort Steekine exploded in the harbor. It was carrying a cargo of ammunition hidden under cotton waste and gold bars. The explosion sent a flurry of gold ingots across the city. In Bombay law, one of those bars is said to have sliced through the neck of a horse, which then ran headless through the streets until it finally collapsed. Other people still remember a tragedy that occurred another April even longer ago, in 1891, when two Parsi girls fell to their death from the Rajabai clock tower. In some corners of Khushrubagh and Kharegat colony, they're still debating whether this was an accident or whether the teenagers hurled themselves off the tower to escape the attentions of a man who may have been pursuing them, and they were trying to protect their honor. In my neighborhood of Bandra, they still tell the story of a young man who was sitting on a wall one day in the late 1960s, playing My Sweet Lord, when a scraggly hippie with a guitar on his back stopped to listen. As the Bandra boy finished the tune, the hippie is supposed to have exclaimed, "You play that song even better than I do. My name is George Harrison." And as a sign of his approval, Harrison is said to have taken the guitar off his back and given it to the chap as a gift. As I was reading Ajoy Bose's fascinating book about the Beatles in India, I decided I should play my parochial part by doing a little research about the Beatles in Bandra. Of course, many stories about the Beatles in Bombay are already well known. A few years ago, I participated in a BBC program by the writer Sarfraz Mansoor called Bombay's Beatle. The show revolved around the time in 1968 when George Harrison came to the city to record the soundtrack of a film called Wonderwall. And the soundtrack featured Indian classical musicians like the tabla player Mahapurush Mishra, the Sur Bahar player Chandra Shekhar, and Santoor maestro Shiv Kumar Sharma. We walked down Firozshah Mehta Road to peer at the fading sign of the HMV studio where the sessions had taken place. And Sarfraz interviewed some of the musicians about their time in the studio with Harrison. Years ago, I bought an enormous book of pictures and photographs and other memorabilia called The Beatles Anthology. And I was delighted to find on page 280 the image of a memo that had been sent to Neil Aspinall, the band's manager, from HMV's India office about the trip Harrison was planning to make to Bombay in 1968, in January. And it refers to one of Ravi Shankar's senior students, Shambhu Das. "You have all the details of the trip on the VIP itinerary," the memo said. "The studios have been booked from the 9th to the 12th inclusive, and they have shipped the stereo equipment in for George's use. The name and address of the Indian friend of George's who has made all the arrangements for accommodation and who has been informed of what time your flight arrives is Shambhu Das of Willow Manorama, Swami Vivekananda Road, Bandra, Bombay 50. Since reading this, I've been trying to look out for Villa Manorama each time I walk down SV Road, but I haven't spotted it yet. So to try to piece together the story of Bandra's Beatle, I thought it would be a good idea to try to track down the chap who Harrison gifted this guitar to. I first heard that story from another guitar player called Charlie Britt, who, for reasons that are now shrouded in the mists of time, is known in Bandra as Charlie Bonda. When I went to see him a few days ago, Charlie told me that his mother was certain that she had seen George Harrison walk down Pali Hill Road several times. And he confirmed bits of the story about the chap on the wall, only it turned out he wasn't from Bandra after all. He was from Santa Cruz, and his name was Glenn Lopez. Charlie warned me that Glenn had become a recluse, and so it would perhaps be a little difficult to talk to him. When I finally got hold of Glenn on the phone, it transpired that Charlie was partially right. Glenn told me firmly but politely that he couldn't meet me in person, and that he was wary about talking on the phone because his phone line was tapped. He said he'd never spoken to any journalists about this episode, and then he proceeded to talk to me for 20 minutes. There was no wall involved and no scraggly hippie wandering by. As it turned out, Glenn had been introduced to Harrison by a mutual friend, he wouldn't say who, and spent several evenings jamming with Harrison at the friend's home. And of course, he wouldn't tell me where exactly it was. The first time they met, Glenn said he decided to play a Brazilian tune. Harrison laughed and said, "Brazilian?" For a man who was trying to discover the very soul of India, it seemed odd to find Indians who could play all the bossa nova classics and sing in perfect Portuguese. Of course, Harrison didn't think it odd that a long-haired fellow from Liverpool was trying to learn how to play the sitar. Anyway, these jam sessions proceeded for several evenings. Among those who was also there, Glenn said, was Dilip Naik, the fabulous Bollywood sessions guitar player. Evidently, these jams were recorded, but Glenn isn't sure who has the tapes. Glenn also told me that Harrison had a few meetings with K.R.C. Lord, the multi-instrumentalist who was at that point a rising star in the world of Bollywood music, who lived opposite Almeida Park, and so it's actually quite likely that Charlie Bonda's mom saw him walk by. Shortly after, one day when Harrison had returned to England, Glenn was told that he'd left a guitar behind for him. It wasn't a gift, evidently, so much as a loan. Glenn was told that Harrison didn't want to keep carting the instrument up and down between continents, so he should keep it until Harrison returned to India. As it turned out, Harrison never came back to reclaim that guitar. Last night, I decided to see if any of this information could be corroborated online. There was absolutely nothing about it. But to my great delight, I discovered that there is a second Harrison guitar in the suburbs. It's prominently displayed on the wall of a restaurant called Cafe Gostana. And Arpana Gwalani, who owns the place, told me the charming story of how it got there. Evidently, Harrison had stayed at a hotel on Pali Hill called Oscar, which I think is now called Le Sutra. And opposite that is Padamsi Apartments. When Ismail Padamsi of Padamsi Apartments heard that Harrison was in the neighborhood, he invited him for tea. Harrison enjoyed himself so much that he returned there several times. And when he was leaving, he gave Padamsi one of his guitars, a Gibson made in Japan. Years later, when Padamsi's grandson realized that his friend Arpana was a huge Beatle maniac, he passed it on to her. And if you're up to it, you can go down to Arpana's cafe, get photographed with the instrument, and eat a special 7-pulse vegetarian burger she's created. You need to tell the waiter you want to eat the George. Listening to Arpana and Glenn tell me their stories and reading Ajoy's book this past fortnight reminded me of the incredible power of the songs that the Beatles created. Their tunes are so captivating, they've left each of us with the conviction that we have individual connections with those 4 musicians, even if we don't actually possess a physical artifact that they once owned. They've touched the lives of people around the world in unimaginable ways, some tiny, some rather more cosmic. For one Sindhi couple on the street next to mine, a Beatles song made them decide to name their baby Michelle. Others have been inspired to get tickets to ride on magical mystery tours, to come to an understanding that all they need is love to follow the sun. As the world changes and we come to the realization that all things must pass, the magic of the 300 tunes or so that the Beatles recorded remind us that there's one thing we can rely on. As they pointed out, all you got to do is twist and shout with a little help of your friends. Thanks.
Thank you, Naresh, for sharing these interesting anecdotes, bringing the Beatles to life again, almost after 50 years, perhaps. I'm now going to request for the official book launch, Mr. Kamal Murarka, Siddharth Bhatia, and the man of the hour, Ajoy Bose, to come on stage to launch the book, along with Naresh.
So you begin, by the way, by talking about yourself and your futile bid to grow your hair. What happened?
Well, you know, before we do this conversation, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank a few people. It's quite amazing to be here in Bombay. I know Bombay because I did Sunday Observer with Vinod Mehta here. I used to come here very often. I was in charge of the Delhi bureau. And Bombay has a very special place in my heart because I always thought that Bombay was a place which had a certain sense of culture. I come from Calcutta, and Calcutta does as well. But Bombay, because of many of these bands which were there, had a certain understanding of rock music. But I want to thank, firstly, Mr. Kamal Morarka and Mr. Gopi Manchanda for helping me with this event. I want to thank Asat Lalji and the wonderful Avid team for organizing. It's really absolutely wonderful. I mean, the Royal Opera House is the first time I'm coming here, the restored one, and it looks really splendid, and they've done such a fantastic job. I want to thank Naresh Fernandez, who I write for very often, and he's done a really wonderful job in leading the coverage of the book. And of course, my very old friend Siddharth Bhatia, who is here to discuss the book with me. But yes, Siddharth, to turn to your question now. You know, I was just day before yesterday in Calcutta launching the book with Usha Uttup. Usha Uttup launched the book with this absolutely rollicking performance at the Dalhousie Institute Club. And so much nostalgia for me because the Beatles and Usha came into my life almost simultaneously. And the Beatles came into my life when I was a teenage rebel. And I think I liked their music, of course, but I also liked them even more because my father hated them so much. So my fiercest fights in my teenage years were, as Siddharth says, about the length of my hair. The sort of psychedelic flowers I wanted to put on my shirt, because those were the fights we used to have, you know, with our parental generation. And there is a certain, we are called the Beatles generation, and therefore there is a special connect about the Beatles. And when a political commentator like me was offered this book by Penguin, by its editor-in-chief Meru Gokhale, she should be here somewhere, I just grabbed it with both hands because, gosh, I mean, I've been, you know, writing about Mayawati, I've been writing about Uttar Pradesh politics, and for really the past 4 decades, I've been dealing with politics, and this seemed to be something which really, really appealed to me, to get out of politics and do something which, you know, also would test my writing skills, because it was not something to do with just political expertise. Of course, I was a Beatles fan, and it was a labor of love, really. And once I started doing my research, Siddharth, I found that actually I didn't really know anything about the Beatles. There's so many stories about the Beatles which I didn't know. And therefore, it was actually a great discovery for me, to understand this very, very incredible band, very, very different band from other bands in a more, in-depth fashion.
But somewhere in what you said is a curious kind of paradox, that most of us who know some idea about the Beatles and some idea about their visit to India know some of the basics, right? They came here, they lived in Rishikesh, they tried to learn TM and other things. They got angry, left after the so-called incident, and went and meanwhile wrote 30 to 40 songs which were informed by their stay here. And the White Album came out, and it was a leap ahead, brilliant leap ahead. In fact, let's be honest, every album of theirs was a leap ahead. So what did you think that you would discover that would be so new that nobody knew about or nobody had heard about?
You know, what I discovered was that Rishikesh tends to be looked at just at that trip which the Beatles did. The Beatles-India connection is often dismissed as just that sojourn at Rishikesh, how it started and how it ended. But what I found in my research, that actually the Indian journey of the Beatles started 3 years ago, when George Harrison picked up a guitar, almost accidentally, at this film set.
A sitar, you mean?
Oh, sorry, picked up a sitar. And George's fascination with this strange-looking Indian instrument never has been explained. George himself didn't know why he was so attracted to the sitar. And I do believe that there is something like destiny which played a role for George to get so fascinated by that sitar that he continued his pursuit of Indian music, of trying to understand. And then he met Ravi Shankar. And then Ravi Shankar led him to a totally different interpretation of India, because with Ravi Shankar, George learned that the sitar has many strings, that the sitar is not just a musical instrument, but it's also a pathway to Indian culture, and Indian culture itself is intrinsically linked to Indian faith. And I think that journey nobody has really put together, because I think it's George Harrison's connect to a whole range of Indian cultural and religious motives that deepened this relationship between George and India. But I think the other Beatles did not have that same connect. But the other Beatles were at a stage, and the entire band was at a stage, when they were looking at ways and means of reinventing themselves. Now, it's really intriguing, and I think that is why the Beatles were the greatest band ever, is because for a band in '65, when they had reached their absolute peak of success, where there were hysterical audiences after them, where their albums were hitting #1 all the time, they had made a huge amount of money. They were really incredibly famous. They were cult figures. And that's the time the Beatles decides that they want to be different. They want to completely change their personalities. And I think the India connection has a lot to do with this reinvention of the Beatles from pop stars into serious musical artists who did some incredible innovation in the studio, playing music backwards, for instance. I mean, it's just incredible. So Indian music had a role in this. Indian culture, Indian religion also played a role. So the band, the other members of the band, although they did not have George's special connect, also were looking for something very different.
No, so it was a kind of a karmic journey, coming together of several things. The world was changing at that time, if you remember. You know, a new rebellious youth cohort was rising. The Beatles were finding, you know, that they were a bit jaded. They needed something else. I was fascinated to read that even before they actually landed in India, they had already started experimenting. Norwegian Wood, of course, but Tomorrow Never Knows, which is, you know, for me, one of their great songs pre-Rishikesh. So already that was happening. You see a whole confluence of things happening. The Beatles, yes. Their own inner journeys, yes. Their sense that something more needs to be done, yes. And their technical innovations. But much more was happening. It was like the universe was conspiring. And then comes first Ravi Shankar, then comes the George Harrison, who then decides, yes, I like this sound and I like this pathway. The others agreeing with him. They could have easily turned around and said no. And all that is heading in one direction, and a whole series of other things start happening. What amazed me is that it reminded me that these were just 20-year-old guys.
No, it's quite amazing because, these are not just very young people. They're really working class lads from Liverpool, didn't read too many books, they didn't go to fancy universities. And they just played in, nightclubs before. They had no clue about, philosophy, art, and everything. All of this, the Beatles start, after they reach this huge peak of fame as pop stars. But I think what really amazes me is the ability of the Beatles to turn what was happening already in the West, the counterculture of the 60s, into, because they were so successful, for the Beatles to embrace this counterculture. It made a huge difference to counterculture itself. The point which I'm trying to make is not only did the 60s counterculture influence the Beatles influenced the 60s counterculture because they were such icons. They were really so famous. And I think that the Beatles started a trend which, let's take, they're coming to India. I think that started this whole journey of the hippies in such a big way. This whole backpacker lot which came. There was a huge, huge difference, which the Beatles made to the perception in the West of what India was. That's the other very interesting, really, theme which I found, which takes it beyond just a trip to Rishikesh, because on the one hand, this was the first time that a young, emerging, post-colonial generation of Indians were engaging with a completely post-World War II West. And I think that this engagement, which was the beginning of the kind of global society we know, the global culture we know, because now, there's so much fusion music, there's so much cultural engagement. But those days, India and the West, there was a distance. And I think the Beatles built this bridge, and I think it's very, very important in the sort of 50th anniversary to pay a tribute to the Beatles, that they really made that first step.
What was your point of entry as an author, as to think about the idea of the book? Because it could have easily turned into a simple story, but it's actually a lot of backstory. There is an entire chapter on who the Maharishi was, and we don't know who the Maharishi was, despite the fact that he became quite famous. I remember as recently as about 20 odd years ago, he was giving ads in The Economist about building this. He had settled in Switzerland and all that, but we didn't know much about him. There were no books written on him. How did you approach that to say, I want to build a story about, because the fact of their arriving in Rishikesh comes much later in the book, that this is what I want to say, and this is how I'm going to enter the story?
That's an excellent question, because my book is not just about the Beatles. It's about some fascinating characters that really are so evident in this journey of the Beatles to India. And the Maharishis, the guru, the giggling guru, is a very important, person, fascinating character, because his claim to be a monk, his claim to be a spiritual leader, if you look at his background, he was just the secretary of the Shankaracharya. he was the wrong caste. He was not a Brahmin, so he was not anointed as a monk, really, in the ashram. So he completely reinvents himself, and he realizes that if he stays in India, he's not going to be really accepted. So he goes abroad. First he goes to the Far East, and then he goes to the US.
And he goes to the Far East because it's cheaper.
Absolutely, because he had to collect money for his ticket. And I found actually this sub-story so interesting because, you know, if I'm going to write about the Beatles in Rishikesh, I must understand also Maharishi, you know, this man who actually brought the Beatles to India. And therefore, going to the US and converting a whole bunch of Americans with this very interesting new thing called transcendental meditation. And it worked brilliantly with the Americans because they really didn't have to give up anything. Maharishi allowed you to eat anything, drink anything, carry on with your job. All you had to do was just half an hour of this mantra, this secret mantra, which is going to calm you down. And the Americans really flocked to that. And he became very, very popular. The Beatles gave him the star power. The Beatles were stars. They were the biggest stars in the world.
He was desperately looking for a celebrity disciple.
Absolutely. And I discover material written by his part-time chauffeur, associate, you know, a British lady, who gives some very interesting insights on what Maharishi actually thought of the Beatles. And he was, I think, quite clearly he wanted to use the Beatles, but not in a, you know, in an ugly manner. I think he, as a guru, saw the opportunity of the Beatles really making a big difference in, you know, really spreading his message.
But they were getting something out of him. You write one of the chapters, which I think is a pretty seminal, it's a cutoff point when Brian Epstein dies, and these guys who used to get their money from him, he organized everything, he spoke to the press, he suddenly dies, and these guys are left bereft. They are completely without anybody to tell them what to do, to lead them. There are, of course, complex wheels within wheels of each member with Epstein. And it worked brilliantly for the Maharishi to have come in as an authority figure of sorts or a guiding figure. John looks up to him, the others look up to him. George is already inclined towards Indian mysticism. So it just magically worked for the Maharishi.
We did, but it also worked for the Beatles because, you know, John, who was particularly devastated by Brian Epstein's sudden death, because their relationship was really very, very close. Many people believe that John Lennon at that point was feeling very suicidal. And long before Janis Joplin or Jim Morrison, John Lennon could be the first big rock star committing suicide. And I think that the Maharishi brought a very calming influence on all of them, particularly at a time when, I mean, again, destiny, because, I mean, look at the coincidence. I mean, there they are, just initiated into their mantras at Bangor in this camp in Wales. And they get this news of Brian Epstein's death. And I had a long session with Patty Harrison, now Patty Boyd, who felt that, and who actually took them to the Maharishi first, because she had actually got into a class of transcendental meditation herself first. But Patty said that, you know, they were like little boys. You know, they were so dependent on Brian Epstein for everything. And as Siddharth points out, they were very young. They were very vulnerable. They didn't know the ways of the world. They were really protected by Brian Epstein on everything. And I think that at that time, there was this feeling that they needed some father figure, some protector. And I think Maharishi did provide that. And when Maharishi said that drop everything and come to India, you know, George was ready to do it immediately. Only thing is, of course, Paul pointed out that we have all these commitments and we have to finish. So they finished all these commitments. But Siddharth, let me sort of explain that the Beatles, as they are described by their fiercest competitor, but very close friend Mick Jagger of the Rolling Stones, as a four-headed monster. The Beatles were four different individuals, and they had different agendas. George, as I have explained, had got into this very deep karmic connection to India. John, who was the most restless in his heart, who was tormented by inner demons, largely because he had a very loveless childhood, because he lost his mother, lost his father, his mother abandoned him, and left to be brought up by his aunt, Mimi. And therefore, I think he was constantly in a mood of rebellion. And I think he needed to calm down. So he tried all kinds of hard drugs. You know, he actually had this large jar filled with various types of drugs, each more lethal than the other. And then he used to have a pestle and a mortar, and he used to actually, you know, grind these things. He on his own admission, he had 1,000 trips in 1 year. And therefore, I think he looked to transcendental meditation as a non-drug capsule to give him instant relief. Of course, he didn't get it, but the fact is that that was his agenda. Paul, on the other hand, saw Rishikesh as a vacation. You know, Paul and his role in the Beatles is often underestimated because he's seen as the commercial one. He's seen as the one who fought with George and John and tried to take over the Beatles. I mean, the book traces this interpersonal relationships in quite a fair amount of detail. But I think Paul did feel that they needed a rest, and this was a time to recharge their batteries. And he was really pleasantly surprised that not only did they have rest, but this was the period which was their most creative, because they wrote those 30 to 40 songs, and they were completely different because these songs were written without any album in mind. They were written as free spirits. And that is why the White Album, which contains most of the songs, has such a unique place, because it's not really an album. It's a collection of different kinds of songs. And there's no actually connection between one song to the other. But I think they do reflect their spirit at Rishikesh as first time these rock stars living as individuals, you know, and also trying to understand themselves. But finally, a word on Ringo, whom Philip Norman, you know, the famous Beatles biographer, the other day in a session with me, called Ringo the runt of the litter. And Ringo is a very lovable character, actually. And although he stayed for just a fortnight at Rishikesh, and he never really weighed in on the important decisions taken by the band, he is really loved by everyone. He's the only one who didn't have a king-sized ego. All the other ones really were driven by very big egos. Ringo just wanted one thing. He wanted to play the drums in the best band of the world.
And by the way, more and more people are realizing, certainly I've, as a layperson and as a fan, realized that I think we must give Ringo a boost here, that his drumming was actually quite complex, because most people have said that he just sat in the background, he didn't have the flair of Ginger Baker or you know, Keith Moon, but actually he was a very complex drummer. A word on anything?
Yes, yes, absolutely. And if you read Ian MacDonald on his Revolution in the Head, which I think is the seminal book on the Beatles' music because he analyzes every song. I think George Harrison was indebted to Ringo because Ringo managed to get George's, Indian music, the use of the Indian zither or the drone, in the music, which is a very interesting innovation. And Ringo kept up those drums. That innovation would not have been possible without Ringo's drumming. So I think Ringo is underestimated because he's not a flash drummer.
No.
Yeah, he's not a flash. Ginger Baker had a completely different technique. But I think Ringo had an intuitive grasp of what his other band members wanted, and he played along. I think Ringo was very essential for the Beatles. I think without Ringo, that band would have fallen apart much earlier. And for their music, he provided the glue.
So I just want to go back to the trips, because the trips are actually, to me, as I see the journey, those LSD trips, are to me they provide a pathway again to John especially, but he tires of them. But that sequence, the drugs first and the drug of transcendental meditation later, is part of the sequential thing of completely wanting new experiences and wanting something that could give them some sense of what they wanted to become from a earlier teenage band to something more complex. And if you say Rubber Soul to White Album, which is Drugs and Maharishi, then you realize that that really was their most creative period. So do you think it just came in a sequence?
The role of drugs is something quite important in the evolution of the Beatles and the evolution of the counterculture of the 60s. I was having a chat in London when I was researching the book with one of the most original hippies, Duncan Campbell, who later became a journalist for Guardian, which I worked for, and his wife, Julie Christie, of course, who you all know, was a famous star. And she was a backpacker and also very much a part of the counterculture. And Julie particularly was very emphatic that there would not have been any counterculture without drugs. And I think it is very strange how Indian music and the India connection goes almost simultaneously and in a kind of parallel manner with their increasing involvement with hard drugs. As you know, of course, that they were first introduced to pot, narcotics, by Bob Dylan. The first time they meet, and Bob Dylan rolls them a joint. And that's, a great meeting, actually.
I'm sure you don't have to explain what that means.
Yes, of course. But I think that their affair with LSD, which comes almost accidentally because they are trapped into LSD by their dentist.
What a fascinating story.
That is an amazing story. Amazing story.
Even the taxi ride at night.
Absolutely. I mean, they are, there is George and John and their wives, and they are like roaming all around London, stoned out of their mind. First time they've taken LSD. And then they finally end up, it's traumatic for Cynthia Lennon, and she feels it's horrific. Patty, I asked Patty that what did she feel when she was stoned out of mind that first trip. And she really smiled and said, it was the 60s. So we were up for everything. But both George and John, although they were quite traumatized by parts of that trip they took, they felt that it really opened their consciousness, their minds. And I think that is one of the things which definitely there was a part of the 60s counterculture, the 60s looking at various things and questioning things. the art that grew out of the 60s counterculture. Drugs was very much a part of it. So I think John's increasing dependence on hard drugs was almost inevitable. And although he weaned himself away from that terrible regime he had before he went to Rishikesh, there is no question that he continued with drugs. And so did George, although, it's very funny because I relate this story about how George got put off by hard drugs because he went to the hippie capital of the world, Haight-Ashbury in San Francisco, and he sees these hippies, and they are actually in serious distress. He suddenly realizes, because I think George was used to taking a trip in a much more relaxed manner, in a much more genteel atmosphere. And this rough crowd of hippies really scared him. And that's a really and he really gave up drugs. He gave up those hard drugs. And that is just before they meet the Maharishi.
Coming to before, apart from the Beatles and before the Beatles, there was Mia Farrow, whose sister was, slightly spaced out and had mental issues. And they came here. And that's a story in itself, the whole Mia Farrow and Prudence thing.
So I'm glad you asked it because, that's the thing about the book. I mean, it's really people from across the universe. I mean, I discovered Mia Farrow just divorced from Frank Sinatra. I mean, these are big names, okay? I mean, Frank Sinatra, still having an almost, husbandly interest in what Mia is up to at the ashram. Mia is like this butterfly who flits across the ashram. The Maharishi is completely entranced. I think at one point the Maharishi said, I don't care about the Beatles. I mean, Mia is my person. And it's amazing because I have a lot of details about Mia Farrow. And Mia Farrow knew that she had this hold over Maharishi. However, I think she also was a very temperamental, very spoiled person. So she used to also not like the attention given by the Maharishi and suspected that he was making a pass at her. Now, there is that famous story, that famous incident where in his puja room, Mia is initiated into the mantra. And then what happened, nobody knows. Because Mia in her autobiography writes that I found this hairy arms around me. Which she later, as typically, Hollywood actresses do, said maybe I wasn't quite sure what he intended. Prudence Farrow, her sister, who was very much into transcendental meditation, feels that Mia was completely misreading the thing and that it was Maharishi's manner in embracing, his very favorite disciples. So just after they've been initiated. So we don't know what happened, but Mia certainly lends a very fascinating atmosphere. And of course, her sister, Prudence Farrow, exactly the opposite, completely drab, goes straight into meditation, so much into meditation that the Beatles are called to sing a song to her, and that, of course, is the famous Dear Prudence. And John, of course, had this line about Mia Farrow, about Prudence Farrow, that why she has locked herself and meditating so furiously? Because she wants to be the first one to go to heaven.
The so-called incident, which actually also was used by John Lennon to say we can't be here anymore. He wrote Sexy Sadie, which was supposed to be about the Maharishi. Later, he goes and in an interview to the Rolling Stone, if you know, says that this is what happened. But there's sufficient, it's a gray area because he wanted to get the hell out of there because he was thinking about Yoko Ono at that time. And on the plane, his marriage was coming apart. He didn't want to admit it. He confesses on the aircraft. And So that incident may or may not have happened.
There's a lot of confusion about this. Firstly, people confuse the allegations against Maharishi to do with Mia Farrow. That Mia Farrow incident actually had happened earlier.
Much before.
Much before. Mia Farrow had already left the ashram. This was a specific allegation to do with an American nurse who was, visiting, who was one of the inmates and a participant in the camp. And this charge was brought about by this very controversial Greek, part of the Beatles camp, a man called Magic Alex. And Magic Alex is a very interesting character because he is John's technical guru, because he's an electronics whiz kid and he's constantly promising them absolutely weird inventions, some of them which actually came about 3 decades later. But Magic Alex suddenly lands up in India. Now, why would an electronics engineer who was a part of the Beatles, a larger sort of thing of getting their musical equipment, and he had no role in India. But mysteriously he turns up, and as soon as he turns up, he starts lobbying against the Maharishi. And that has led to this belief that it was Magic Alex who was jealous about Maharishi's, influence on John particularly, but also on the other Beatles, and therefore he wanted to break up their picnic at Rishikesh. And I think that may not be strictly true, because I do believe, and this is what Patty also felt, and this is what Cynthia has written in her book, that John himself was tired and he went along with these allegations, because otherwise, this allegation that Maharishi would suddenly turn on one of his inmates, or whether the Beatles were not prudes. If you look at their lives, they certainly weren't. But that's, the final thing which you said, Siddharth, about John Lennon's confessions, and that's how I end that chapter, confessions to Cynthia Lennon about all the affairs he's had, is quite interesting, because I think it was deliberate. He was trying to really destroy their marriage so that he could then,
Because he had met Yoko by then.
He had met Yoko, and he wanted Cynthia to be completely, disenchanted with him.
So they go off. The journey from the ashram, I'm not going into too much detail because people must read it, but the journey from the ashram to Delhi is, is just a romp with the car breaking down and everything. They reach the hotel, they have a shower and a lot of whiskey, and then they go back, and they are changed. The Maharishi had this fantastic idea of exploiting them for a film. He does some hera-feri with a couple of film contracts and all that. But they go back, and the Beatles have changed, and their music has changed. And what we perceive today as, another stage in their journey, it happens. And I'm going to jump a bit and also posit, and you can talk about it, that eventually after that they make one or two more albums after White Album, Let It Be, and one more.
Well, it is White Album, Abbey Road, and Let It Be.
Let It Be.
Yeah, White Album.
And they are hurtling towards breaking up by then, and rediscovering themselves and all that. Where do you see, what is the lasting impact on them of these 7 weeks or a few weeks?
Well, there are different interpretations. I mean, Philip Norman, for instance, feels that they would have broken up even earlier if they had not come to Rishikesh. I mean, certainly both George and John, even before they went to Rishikesh, were pretty fed up in being Beatles. And I think both of them write extensively on how stifled they were feeling in the Beatles, being in the Beatles. George wanted to pursue more seriously his relationship with Indian culture and Indian faith, and he felt that the Beatles didn't quite suit him. He always felt that he was cheated in any case because he wasn't allowed to produce more songs. Usually each album had just a few songs by George. John felt that Yoko had come into his life and he needed to move on. So when they came to Rishikesh, it is true that they, at least two of them, did not want to continue with the Beatles. Paul, on the other hand, who always was the kind of brand manager of the Beatles, was very keen that they continue. And Ringo, as I said, he was very keen that the Beatles survive. But I cannot but feel that here was a period where the Beatles were completely free to be themselves as individuals and not as the band they were used to. They used to think collectively earlier, but now they were really thinking on their own. And I have a feeling that that changed quite a bit, you know, their perceptions about themselves and about their futures. Here was a time when they didn't have to do any touring, of course. There were no studio recordings, and even the music they produced came about almost naturally. So I think that they just felt that the time was up. And you know, Siddharth, what really intrigues me and what I admire about the Beatles, but even when they were really fighting with each other, even when everybody knew that they had a very little amount of time left together, and some of these fights in the studios was terrible, particularly after John started bringing Yoko in to be almost a fifth Beatle. They were producing incredibly good music. I mean, usually a band, when they have these dissensions, you know, their music is affected, their music deteriorates. But if you look at the Beatles' discography, I think that the Abbey Road is a great album. It really stands on its own, you know, in the innovations and musical genius. So I think this was a very, very special group of musicians we were looking at, with all their flaws, with all their faults. But I think as far as music is concerned, they were masters.
What did you, as a music lover, Beatles lover, from that generation, end up feeling about them at the end of writing this?
Well, I had a great sense of fulfillment on several scores. I was very flattered at getting this offer to write Beyond Politics, and I think I have done a good job. I also felt that the Beatles was a group which affected me deeply in my early years, and that by researching them and writing about them, you know, you did express your own admiration. Mind you, and I'm very glad that some of the early reviews have noted that this is not a hagiographic account by any means, that I've been fairly objective about their faults. I've traced all the ugly fights they've had with various people. But the fact of the matter is that the Beatles, to me, is a fairy tale which I don't think will really go stale. And this is something we keep on discussing, that how come the Beatles saga continues? How come people across because we are the Beatles generation, but people, you know, much younger than us and across, you know, generation after generation, you know, fall in love with the Beatles, and we wonder why. And Philip Norman tells me that the Beatles, and Philip Norman, you know, knew the Beatles, I interviewed them many times. He told me that the Beatles themselves never believed that they would last more than 10 or 20 years after they broke up. It's quite amazing that, you know, that hasn't happened, and we're still, you know, writing a book on the Beatles and, you know, launching the Beatles at the Royal Opera House here. But I mean, it's a romance. And you know, I still remember that when I went to Rishikesh to do my research there, and there's just ruins there, but people from across the country, across the world come and visit. So I met this 18-year-old girl, and she had come to see this, whatever was left of where the Beatles stayed. And her mother told me that, she's so crazy about the Beatles that she dragged us here. We had gone to see some temples, but she's very keen. So I asked this girl that, the Beatles happened in the last century. I mean, what do they mean to you? So, she thought a bit and she said, they're one group who appeal to the heart. And I think that's the thing about the Beatles. There's something about them which go directly.
I went to the ashram a couple of years ago, and of course it's a very different ashram than it was. Some of the buildings were destroyed and they're rebuilt. And
only the Maharishi's bungalow remains.
It's still there, and it's still, with a beautiful view of the sea.
Absolutely. Of the river.
Of the river, sorry. And earlier, people used to sneak through the barbed wire, and the forest department, which runs it, now offers tickets.
Yes.
And when I went there with all the graffiti, and it was fairly crowded on a weekday in the middle of the non-tourist season. And you go and you find these fellow pilgrims, and you can kind of guess, you look at buildings and you look at and you think maybe this song was written there. And they wrote a frivolous song like Obla Di Oblada, completely, we don't know what it is, to very, very deep songs, and satirical songs like Bungalow Bill. And I was just telling someone that, I didn't know Bungalow Bill so well, and now I know its entire story.
Absolutely. Bungalow Bill is quite an amazing sort of tale, really, because it's one of my favorite songs, really, from the White Album. And it tells a story, and once I started researching it, it actually happened. I mean, there was somebody who sneaked off, from the meditation camp to shoot a tiger. And then came back and apologized to the Mahesh Yogi that he had done so. But, when you talk about the camp, the good news is, the ruins are now going to be replaced, I am told, by a museum, and they're slowly getting the act together. There's a very big event coming up, a 3-day event in September, and I think that could spark off. And I think we, as Indians, should be really using this huge, opportunity, of creating a memorial to the Beatles, which will be very popular, in India and, the rest of the world.
Though I would suggest to friends here that see it before September at least once if you can, because then it will be a slightly even more different kind of thing. One last question about the book rather than, why are there no photographs?
Now, there's a story about it. Most of the photographs...
Because a lot of people may have asked you
Sure,
this.
sure, absolutely. Actually, I was let down, by somebody who promised me photographs. And these were photographs never seen before, because there was this gentleman whom I mentioned called Avinash Kohli, who's a tour operator and very, very close to Maharishi and his disciples. And he had taken some amazing photographs, which were a private collection. Avinash Kohli died some years ago, but his daughter Shanti had promised me those photographs. Unfortunately, she had given the photographs to her stepbrother, who has the photographs, and he suddenly last moment decided that he did not want them to be published. Now we were stuck because there's not much point in publishing photographs which are already been published.
Paul's pictures?
Well, Paul's pictures have been publicized so much. He himself has written. So it would not add anything to the book unless I was really, adding something with them. I don't think so, because I think the doodles, inside are quite cute. But what really I love about this book, and this is a book you judge by its cover, because there's a stunning cover, front cover as well as the back cover, and they've lent itself to many creative sort of promotional material, which I find, but they are great. So, you know, every book, I think, has its own particular sort of, you know, appeal. And I think this book, you know, since we could not print, publish photographs which were completely original and unique, you know, it's better to go without them rather than not.
Well, it's a great read. I must tell you also that it's a very, of course it's engaging, but it's also very, one has to concentrate a lot because you have gathered material from far and wide, including people who repaired the sitars and the guitars in Dehradun and Rishikesh. So it's, and a lot of granular detail, a lot of funny moments, but overall, a reflective kind of book, which is certainly, to me, added a lot to my knowledge of this great band. So I can't see a single person. I mean, I'm so engaged, but I think would you be open to a couple of questions? Yeah, but I can't see a thing. House lights? Ah, yes.
Somebody there?
Yeah, please.
You have to give him a mic, yeah.
Yeah, okay. So, Mr. Bose, seeing as you're more of a political writer, primarily, I guess, so I wanted to ask you, do you believe, while looking at the movement now, that perhaps some of the consequences of this counterculture movement were kind of negative, like for someone in my generation? Not in the sense that counterculture should die, but in the sense that, okay, I'm Indian, and for me it's amazing that the Beatles came, and of course, like I would love to talk about that, but in the West, now when you think of a place like Rishikesh or Varanasi, it's just like, oh, you can go there to do drugs and escape, and even a place like Nepal, oh, it's just a Shangri-La, let's escape all our problems. And I feel like that kind of exotic aspect reduces the overall culture, and it's pretty much sold in a way that's not really representative. And does your work address that aspect of it at all? And if so, or if not, yeah.
Well, you know, part of this reaching out by the West to Eastern mysticism, a part of it was to do with this exotica. Let's not make any mistake about it. And I think there were various levels of engagement with different people. I think some people, where you very correctly say, felt that, you know, this was a way of just, you know, being fashionable, you know, being in. And it became quite a fashion, really, to do a trip to India, to do a backpacking trip. But, you know, I think this cultural, sort of osmosis that happened between the West and the East, it cannot be dismissed as a fad or as a movement which has been debased. Because the 60s, as Siddharth was pointing out, was a very unique time. And we know it's a time of upheaval and turmoil and a lot of changing, and a lot of people were reaching out across the world and looking at each other's cultures, each other's histories. So I do believe, and my book, mind you, and that's one thing which this book doesn't try to do, is put too much of a spin on anything. When I started the book, I confess that I had an idea that maybe I'll write more on the 60s culture and what the Beatles trip, to look at that. But you know, somehow, when I started writing the book, the story took over. So although the first chapter is India and the Beatles, where I write about what Beatles meant to India, including me, after that, it's a chronological account written almost like a script, you know, about various things that happen. And of course, in their own words often, because they could be, I quote. But, so I don't overtly deal with the cultural implications of it or make no overt analysis. But I do believe that we are enriched by this 60s movement in various forms, counterculture. And although some of them have ended up as very sad dreams which never got realized, I still think it's a very unique period of contemporary history.
By the way, you may have heard this or read this. A lot of people after the Beatles also had Indian kind of connect, if not influence. Led Zeppelin, The Who, Baba O'Reilly, and of course Donovan comes here. So India was not a little more than a fad, as you pointed out.
Oh yes, and I think that Ravi Shankar, for instance, was in two minds, because on the one hand, and Ravi Shankar is another character which I think comes out very powerfully in the book, and I deal with him extensively because he's an absolutely fascinating character, and as George Harrison called him, the godfather of global music. I think that, it is quite a strong role. But Ravi Shankar himself was a little two-minded about what the sitar craze meant. On the one hand, he was, I think, quite touched at this whole aspect of the sitar now appealing not just to concert halls, but to massive audiences. So at Woodstock, at Monterey, when Ravi Shankar played, he was astounded at this reach he had. At the same time, when he saw people taking drugs, people often making love, while they were listening to
He was very unhappy at Woodstock.
He was very unhappy, and I think that that went against his traditional sort of sense and structure of, the sitar and classical music. So it's and for us, when we look back, it's not just the music, even this whole quest for the mantra seems a little comical. We are, used to, as Indians, people chanting mantras, but, for a Westerner, there was a certain naivete in, a young man of 22 years, very famous, very rich, but wanting happiness and thinking he could do so by chanting a mantra. But at the same time, I think there is a sincerity, and there is also, in George's case certainly, and John's case, a lot of intellectual rigor in trying to pursue this path. And I think they tried. It's not probably that they got everything they were looking for, but I think even that, this attempt to engage with a completely different culture, I think we need to appreciate that.
Hi, I've got two questions for you. One is more generic. What are the deeper themes of their music that they took to the West? And the second is, which is your favorite Beatles song from this era?
I always get, foxed by this whole favorite song bit, because I know I like so many songs. But I must say that a song which John wrote just before he came to India, and he recorded, that was the last thing the Beatles recorded just before they came to India, is the title of the book, Across the Universe. And although I'm not too sure whether I like that Jai Gurudev part, but but it's very haunting, the lyrics. And I think the lyrics are haunting also after I researched the context of it, because John explained how he wrote the song. That actually it started with a nagging session by his wife, and they were in the bedroom, and his wife was nagging him, probably about Yoko Ono, and he escaped the bedroom, he comes out, and then he starts writing this, song, which he takes to a different level, to a spiritual level. So it's really John Lennon who could only do that. So I would say Across the Universe. I'm sorry, and the other question which you said was? the deeper things to the West. Well, I think they took a sense of Indian culture, about Indian philosophy and Indian music, to back to the West. They certainly popularized the idea of India, and they changed the idea of India also, because I think there was a very poor opinion of India earlier on. And I think the Beatles' open admiration of India, there's a very interesting interview which John Lennon gives to Maureen Cleave of the Evening Standard, where he says, after putting on a record of Indian music, he said, look at this. I mean, this goes back thousands of years, this music. And we go and lecture these people about what they should do with their country. So, this respect for India, for a country that had colonized us, I think that's a big takeaway.
Thank you. It's a fascinating session so far. I certainly intend to buy the book. One of the things is, what about Pete Best? Any insights or any backstories that you may not have found interesting enough to include?
Well, Pete Best came at a period of their lives which was the early part. And I deal with, just this 3 years, really. Because, with the Beatles, you could just write volumes and volumes and volumes. And Mark Lewisham is actually writing them. I mean, each book is, I think, about 2,000 pages, and he's going to do 3. So Pete Best is right at the beginning of the Beatles, and of course, it didn't work out with Pete Best, and Ringo Starr came in. But Ringo, played his own role, and I personally feel Pete Best could not be a Ringo Starr.
I don't have a question, but just a comment that Mahesh Yogi's ashram is popularly called Beatles Ashram in Rishikesh. But did you know that all the taxi drivers call it the Vittal's Ashram? They say Vittal's Ashrams.
It's all.
Your book is about the Vittals.
Vittals, yes.
Excuse me. What the?
All right.
Backbenchers.
Hi, good evening.
Very valid point.
I had a question. I'd love to know your take on the Abbey Road album imagery and the conspiracy that Paul is dead. I'm sure you've got an interesting take on that.
Well, I really don't cover the Abbey Road album in my book because it comes after, I end my story. But it is there partially in the aftermath, maybe in the end, the final chapter, where I look at where did the Beatles go after they went out of Rishikesh. But Abbey Road is, to my mind, one of their very creative albums. And this whole conspiracy of Paul dying, even with Sgt. Pepper's, there are songs where they read meanings. One of the things about the Beatles is that because they were such cult figures, every song used to be analyzed. And that was the time when, in London particularly, you had this whole range of very small magazines, rock magazines. And they would start speculation on that. Listen, if you listen to the end of the records, you can hear Paul is dead, Paul is dead, Paul is dead. And then because people were such fans, they would talk about it, discuss, and buy more albums. So I think it was a very good marketing strategy.
Well, Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds.
Lucy in the Sky and Diamonds.
One last question, please.
Excuse me. Can a backbencher speak?
Go ahead.
I would like to talk about the chronological difference between slip disc and bullock cart. Bullock cart was older than slip disc, and slip disc is a notorious place. Okay, coming to your question, you spoke about LSD being very disruptive. By the way, Carlos Santana in at Woodstock was high on LSD and he played Soul Sacrifice very competently.
No, I did not say
So
this.
you have to either defend LSD or...
No. I think to some extent, in fact, I completely agree with you. I think that their music and their drugs were very much, went hand in hand, and a lot of the time they created their best music, not when they were high, because the Beatles never recorded when they were high. They were one group, and they were very clear, and they are on record saying that they never ever.
But that's exactly what I'm pointing out,
Yeah.
that Carlos Santana was high on LSD, and he still managed it.
No,
Okay.
Carlos Santana may. But I think overall, hard drugs played a very positive role in their innovative and inventive music, just like the India connection did. However, also hard drugs took their toll on their bodies, on their minds. And I think John Lennon is a great example, because I think that by the time he reached Rishikesh, he really needed this detox. A lot of people felt that one of the great things that happened to John, that after those even 2.5 months in Rishikesh, he looked much better. His skin had turned completely gray, and there were many people who feared that because he was taking so many drugs, he would have completely, collapsed at one point.
Regarding the
Thank you very... Sorry, we've got to stop. The next phase will
the
begin.
photographs can't be published in that paper, which the book is published.
In fact, the next phase is going to take us to another level. Suresh and Devika are waiting in the wings. Yeah. Thank you, Ajoy. You've got to sign.
Thank you, Ajoy and Siddharth, for this absorbing discussion. Lots of talks of drugs. But 50 years later, we should remember all we need is love. Be prepared to rock on to some of the Beatles' best love numbers with pioneering local rockers, Devika and Suresh Bhojwani. Accompanying them is the pro faculty from the True School of Music. Have a wonderful rest of the evening. Thank you.
Next, Devika and Suresh Bhojwani have been a force to be reckoned with in the Indian music scene for the past 4 decades. Their combined chemistry has swayed many an audience over the years with their intricate arrangements and beguiling duets. Both of these talented musicians come with their own experience and pedigree, and we are delighted to have them perform some of the best-loved Beatles songs on our stage tonight. Performing with them tonight is Adil Karwa on bass, Karan Kanampally on drums, Shaunak Shaha on lead guitars, and Vyoma Shah on keys. Ladies and gentlemen, please give them a big round of applause to welcome them on stage.
So good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Royal Opera House, beautiful building. And an evening to celebrate the Beatles. You just heard Ajoy and Siddharth talk about the book. We're going to sing about their music. Is everyone ready?
Yeah. Yep, we're good to go.
So my speech and all that?
Enough speaking, let's sing.
Words are flowing out like endless rain into a paper cup. They slither while they pass. They slip away across the universe. Pools of sorrow, waves of joy are drifting through my open mind, possessing and caressing me. Jai Guru Deva. Oh, nothing's gonna change my world.
Nothing's gonna change my world. Nothing's gonna change my world. Nothing's gonna change my world.
Images of broken light that dance before me like a million eyes. They call me on and on across the universe. Thoughts meander like a restless wind inside a letterbox. They tumble blindly as they make their way across the universe. Jagododeva.
Oh, nothing's gonna change my world. Nothing's gonna change my world. Nothing's gonna change my world. Nothing's gonna change my world.
Sounds of laughter, shades of life are ringing through my open ears, exciting and inciting me. Limitless and dying love which shines around me like a million suns and calls me on and on across the universe.
Jagododeva. Nothing's gonna change my world.
Sing along.
Nothing's gonna change my world. Nothing's gonna change my world. Nothing's gonna change my world. Jagododeva. Jagododeva. Jagododeva.
Jai Guru
Okay, the next song we're going to do is a beautiful ballad. Actually, it's one of the first ballads that Paul McCartney wrote. And I Love Her. This was way before even Yesterday and some of the other amazing ballads. We think he wrote it actually for Jane Asher, somebody he loved at that point of time. It was 1964. He was living in her home in England, and that's where the song came from. So we have And I Love Her.
I give her all my love, that's all I do. And if you saw my love, you'd love her too. And I love her. She gives me everything, and tenderly the kiss my lover brings, she brings to me. I love her. Her love like ours will never die, as long as I have you near me. Bright are the stars that shine, dark is the sky. I know this love of mine will never die.
dark is the sky. I know this love of mine will never die, and I love her.
Thank you.
Actually, this was a time, these early songs, where raw Beatles, great music, lovely harmonies, and happiness all came together, especially when we were all growing up. Later on, as they evolved, the songs got a lot more serious, a lot more complicated, still harmonies, but maybe not so happy. So let's capture a bit of the happiness.
And I'll miss you. Tomorrow I'll miss you. Remember, I'll always be true. And then while I'm away, I'll ride home every day, and I'll send all my loving to you. I'll pretend that I'm kissing the lips that I'm missing, and hope that my dreams will come true. And then while I'm away, I'll ride home every day, and I'll send all my loving to you. All my loving I will send to you. All my loving, darling, I'll be true. Close your eyes and I'll kiss you. Tomorrow I'll miss you. Remember, I'll always be true. And then while I'm away, I'll ride home every day, and I'll send all my loving to you. All my loving I will send to you. All my loving, darling, I'll be true. All my loving I will send to you. All my loving, darling, I'll be true.
Whoa!
Again, another beautiful love song. And if you guys know the songs, sing. It doesn't age you.
If I fell in love with you,
Would you promise to be true and help me understand? 'Cause I've been in love before, and I found that love is more than just holding hands. If I give my heart to you, I must be sure from the very start that you would love me more than her. If I trust in you, Don't run and hide if I love you too. Oh, please, don't hurt my pride like her, 'cause I couldn't stand the pain, and I would be sad if I knew love was in vain. So I hope you see that I would love to love you, and that she would cry if she learns we are true, 'cause I couldn't stand the pain, and I would be sad if I knew love was in vain. So I hope you see that I would love to love you, and that she will cry if she learns we are true. If I fell in love with you. I'm still not hearing some sing-alongs. Need it, need it, need it. Okay. This is one of my special Beatles songs. It's called In My Life. It was part of the Rubber Soul album that John Lennon actually wrote, and it was basically him looking back 25 years of his life with memories, beautiful memories, some not so beautiful, and but it was a warm salute to all the experiences he had gone through. So it's In My Life. There are places I'll remember all my life, though some have changed, some forever, not for better. Some have gone and some remains. Of these places have their moments with lovers and friends that came before. Some are dead and some are living. In my life, I love them all. But of all these friends and lovers, there is no one compared with you, and these memories lose their meaning when I think of love as something new. Though I know I'll never lose affection for people and things that went before, I know I'll often stop and think about them. In my life, I love you more. Though I know I'll never lose affection for people and things that went before, I know I'll often stop and think about them. In my life, I love you more. In my life, I love you more. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Okay, what you might not have read in the book, or may not be in the book, is this fantastic evening that Devika and I had a chance to spend with George Harrison and Olivia. This happened in Goa on a magical trip. We spent a week together and somehow wound up on a full moon night on the beach outside the Fort Aguada with 2 guitars, and George and me and Devika and Olivia. But all he wanted to do was play Indian music, or Django Reinhardt, for those of you who are musical aficionados. So I begged him, I said, George, I waited all my life for this. Can't we just do one Beatles song together? And he said no. Much to my delight, Olivia, God bless her, turned around to him and said, George, do a song with the gentleman. And this is the song we did. Here comes the sun, here comes the sun, and I say, it's all right. Little darling, it's been a long, cold, lonely winter. Little darling, it seems like years since it's been here. Here comes the sun, here comes the sun, and I say, it's all right. Little darling, I see the smile returning to their faces. Little darling, it seems like years since it's been here. Here comes the sun, here comes the sun, and I say, it's all right. Sun, 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 here we come. 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 That leads me on to one of my most favorite, well-loved Beatles song written by George. It's called While My Guitar Gently Weeps. I look at you all, I see the love there that's sleeping, while my guitar gently weeps. I look at the floor and I see it needs sweeping. Still my guitar gently weeps. I don't know how, nobody told you how to unfold your love. I don't know why someone controlled you. They bought and sold you. look at the world and I notice it turning while my guitar gently weeps. With every mistake we must surely be learning. Still my guitar gently weeps. I don't know why you were diverted, you were perverted too. I don't know how you were inverted. No one alerted you. I don't know why you were diverted. No one alerted you. I don't know how you were inverted. You were alerted too. From the wings at the play you are staging, while my guitar gently weeps. Now I'm sitting here doing nothing but aging, while my guitar gently weeps.
Now, do you want to do Norwegian?
What a song.
You want to do that?
Yes.
We'll go ahead. Okay, the next song we're actually doing was a special song, especially for tonight. It was the first song ever, pop song written, with a sitar played in the background. So it was Norwegian Wood. 1965, George Harrison decided to play sitar on this. And it's a very beautiful song. John wrote about it afterwards. And he said that actually he felt that maybe the sitar could have been used in a different manner, but it all happened so fast. The song was written a lot earlier, and then they incorporated the sitar into it. So it's an interesting combination of the Eastern and Western sound. We're going to try and do it. Yep.
Ready? 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3.
I once had a girl, or should I say, she once had me. She showed me her room, isn't it good, Norwegian wood. She asked me to stay and she told me to sit anywhere. So I looked around and I noticed there wasn't a chair. I sat on a rug biding my time, drinking her wine. We talked until 2, and then she said, it's time for bed. Worked in the morning and started to laugh. I told her I didn't and crawled off to sleep in the back. Then when I awoke, I was alone. This bird had flown. So I lit a fire. Isn't it good? Norwegian wood.
By the way, what I forgot to say is actually this song was supposed to be a message to who was it? John Lennon's wife. He was having an affair with somebody, but he didn't want her to find out, so this was a subtle way of letting her know.
I can do that too.
Try it. I'll give you a ticket to ride.
Whoa.
Okay, the next song.
Just let it be.
Let it be, okay. Okay, we'll do Let It Be. 1 minute, I'm going to say something actually about the song. For years, I sang this song, Mother Mary Came to Me, singing Words of Wisdom. And it so happened 40 years ago, Alec Padamsee did this amazing musical called Jesus Christ Superstar, and he invited me to play Mother Mary on stage. And for years, this became my anthem, Let It Be, Mother Mary Comes to Me. And then, somewhere along the line, I found out that actually it was written, Paul McCartney lost his mother at a very early age to cancer, 14. And he used to dream about her. And one day, much later, when he became a Beatle and successful, he dreamt about her one night. Mother Mary, her name was Mary. And she came to him. And she actually said that it's fine, it's okay, let it be. Words of wisdom. I didn't know how to react to that because I'd already absorbed it as my Mother Mary song. But the truth is, actually, it was his song to his mother. So here we go.
When I find myself in times of trouble, Mother Mary comes to me, speaking words of wisdom, let it be. And in my hour of darkness, she is standing right in front of me, speaking words of wisdom, let it be. Let it be, let it be, let it be, oh let it be. It will be an answer, let it be. And when the broken-hearted people living in the world agree, there will be an answer, let it be. And though they may be parted, there's still a chance that they will see. Shine until tomorrow, let it be. Let it be, let it be, let it be, oh let it be. There will be an answer, let it be. Let it be, let it be, let it be, oh let it be. Whisper words of wisdom, let it be. cloudy, there's still a chance that they will see. Smile until tomorrow, let it be. I wake up to the sound of music. Mother Mary comes to me, speaking words of wisdom. Let it be, let it be, let it be, let it be, oh let it be. There will be an answer, let it be, let it be, let it be, let it be, oh let it be. Come on, there will be an answer, let it be. Everybody, let it be, let it be, let it be, let it be. There will be an answer, let it be, let it be, let it be, let it be, oh let it be. There will be an answer, let it be.
Well, friends, ladies, gentlemen, that brings us to the end of our little effort to put the Beatles across to you. Should we do one more?
No, thank the band first. Thank the band. Thank.
But first, I want to talk about the band. Incredible bunch of musicians. And there we have Shaunak, Lightning Fingers, Easy Smile, and then, of course, Adil on bass. Woo! Amazing guitars. Behind me, the powerhouse, Karun. Hit the drum. Pretty little thing, Vioma, giving us the best backing we've ever had.
They're all from the True School of Music. We have to thank them for rehearsing with us, for making us sound as good as we have. Thank you so much. They actually teach us at
And
the
of
True
course,
School.
she cut me off, but my beautiful wife, Devika.
Do we have time for one more? Yes? Okay, we have permission for one more. Okay, let's hit it. But you have to sing with us.
Ready?
I think I'm gonna be sad. I think it's the day, yeah. The girl that's driving me mad is going away, yeah. She's got a ticket to ride. She's got a ticket to ride. She's got a ticket to ride, but she don't care. She said that living with me was bringing her down, yeah. She would never be free while I was around, yeah. She's got a ticket to ride. She's got a ticket to ride. She's got a ticket to ride, but she don't care. I don't know why she's riding so high. She ought to think twice, she ought to do right by me before she's got to saying goodbye. She ought to think twice, she ought to do right by me. Say that living with me was bringing her down, yeah. She would never be free when I was around, yeah. She's got a ticket to ride. She's got a ticket to ride. She's